I'm Isabel, and this week I read Wuthering Heights. I think this book is deserving of an episode because it's one of the most polarizing classics, especially within like the Regency era women's literature. It's kind of the most controversial of all of them. As an example, when you pull up the Goodreads page, the four books like recommended for readers of Wuthering Heights are Jane Eyre, Pride and Prejudice, Little Women, and Sense and Sensibility. And I've actually read all four of those books, and they all have at least like zero point 0.2 higher out of 5, so they're quite a bit more well liked. Because Wuthering Heights only has a 3.89 on Goodreads, which is quite low for like a renowned classic like this. So I was kind of curious what makes this one so controversial compared to the other ones. And it's been sitting on my bookshelf for a few years at this point, so I figured now is as good a time as any. So we're gonna get right into it. So about like 40 pages into this book, I got so bored that I pulled up the audiobook, and I think I spent a good like 2/3 of the book listening on Spotify, which is weird for me. I am not an audiobook person, so that was kind of a sign that I wasn't really loving the book. I thought that the book was really slow to get into. Even by page 14, I was struggling to read it. Like, I was bored. So it's not a great sign. It's not one of those books where you start it and then are immediately just like sucked in. It's not how this one works. It is not like that at all. So I struggled for a little while. Then by page about 40, I opened up an audiobook and I was worried I was not going to be able to finish it. And I'd come back here and be like, well, I don't know, I didn't finish it. So I kind of had to power through. And I'm glad I did, but it took me a minute. One review says, I stopped at page 42. I couldn't stand the writing. Not only was it difficult to decipher, but sentences, even paragraphs that could have been summed up with a few words were expounded upon pompously for pages. So that's exactly how I felt. It was kind of overly descriptive and a little bit boring at times, which not my favorite. I'm not one for heavy descriptive like prose and stuff. It's not for me. And that's a lot of this book. This review because they stopped basically exactly where I stopped, which I think is funny. It was a bit rough to get into, but we got there. My next complaint about the book is the way it's narrated is basically we have this main character, Lockwood. He's not the main character, but he is the main character. And he comes to Wuthering Heights and rents a room there, basically. He's just there for a year. And while he's there, he's like obsessed with the like girl there, Catherine, who's like the main character Heathcliff's daughter-in-law, and his son is dead. And he's like, that girl's kind of cute. What's her story? And so he's asking around to all these people, figuring out what her deal is. And that's when he meets the maid who works at the house he's living in. And the maid basically explains 20 years ago the history of all the people in the house to Lockwood. And that's basically how the entire book is told, is the maid talking to Lockwood. But we're not with the maid and Lockwood. We're like, it never goes back to the present day. It's all in the past, but the maid is talking. And I found that really confusing, honestly, because you would start a chapter and be like, where are we? Like, who's talking? Who are they talking to? And it was really confusing and not very effective, I thought, because it kind of took me out of the story to just be told everything. It was really distracting. I did not enjoy that. This review actually agreed with me pretty well. So they said, I never expected this book to be as flagrantly, unforgivably bad as it was. To start, Bronte's technical choice of narrating the story of the primary characters by having the housekeeper explain everything to a tenant 20 years after it happened completely kills suspense and intimacy. The most I can say is that to some extent this functions as a device to help shroud the story and motives from the reader. But really, at the time, literary technique hadn't quite always gotten around to accepting that omnipotent third-person narrators are allowed. So you'd have to have a multi-perspective story told by an omnipotent third-person narrator who was actually a character in the story. The layers of perspective make it annoying and sometimes impossible to figure out who was telling what bit of the story. And moreover, because so much is related as two characters explaining things between themselves, the result is that we rarely see any action, and instead of the entire book explained in Socratic, pedantic exposition. The sense of place is poorly rendered and almost entirely missing. And I agree completely. I think it's really frustrating to read it like this, because every time you get attached to something, you're taken out of it by going to the present tense. Or you're in the present and you're really interested, and then you jump back into the past. And so you can't really care about either timeline because you're jumping back and forth so much. And I think it would have been better just have a narrator in the past tense, and as the reader be able to age with the characters, instead of seeing everyone when they're old in the first chapter and then jumping back to the past tense for the next chapter. So it kind of annoyed me, and it left me feeling detached to characters, which this review says too. I've tried it 3 times. I know people are obsessed with it. I hate everyone in the book, and I just can't care about a book where I actually hate the characters. And sure, I get the interpretation that as terrible as Heathcliff and Cathy are, it's their love that redeems them. And isn't that romantic? No. And yeah, I think they're kind of missing a major aspect of the book when they say that their love doesn't redeem them, and that's the whole point. But I don't really think the book is trying to make you like Cathy or Heathcliff. I think Emily Bronte knows that they're bad people, and is more as it's kind of interesting to read about them, and that's why she wrote about them, versus you wanting to root for them and like hoping that they get redeemed by the end, because they definitely don't. It's less about liking the characters and more about understanding them. There are definitely some positives. I think in general I liked the book more than I disliked it. So this person who gave it a 5-star review says, I understand why many people hate this book. Catherine and Heathcliff are monstrous. You won't like them because they are unlikable. They are irrational, self-absorbed, malicious, and pretty much any negative quality you can think a person is capable of possessing without imploding. They seek and destroy and act with no thought to consequence, and I find it fascinating that Emily Bronte chose them to be her central protagonists. When this was first published, it was met with animosity because of how utterly repugnant these 2 characters were. The way they go about their business, caring nothing for others but themselves, was enough for me to shake my head in complete and total judgment, as if Catherine and Heathcliff could see me and are then effectively shamed by their actions. Wuthering Heights is epic, in my humble opinion, because I believe that the scope of the story is monumental. It is a simple tale between 2 families that are bound in such a way that their fates are irrevocably linked. What affects one affects the other. It's about Catherine and Heathcliff who fall in love and how their relationship rules the lives of those around them. The book, all 400 pages of it, occur almost entirely at Wuthering Heights, the estate of the Earnshaws, and at Thrushcross Grange. That's such a hard... Okay, Thrushcross Grange. The estate of the Lintons, with only a couple of miles of land in between. And yet, it is not a small story. And I think that review sums up the book, like, almost perfectly, where it's this very small tale of this one little neighborhood, basically. There's these 2 houses a few miles apart with a bunch of hills in between them. Very hard to walk in between. They make a big deal of people walking between these, like, 2 miles. It's pretty funny. But I think the point is that even though it's just 2 families in their lives, it's applicable to so many other people. The story is more about turning good people into bad people and bad people into good people, and the way people develop over their lives, more than, you know, how people fall in love. And it's not really a love story, even though it follows these 2 central characters who are in love. I think it's more about characters and how people change. And I thought that part was very interesting. I also think it makes a great audiobook. The Spotify narrator was really fun. And I'm not a big audiobook person. I never have been. But this one was actually enjoyable as an audiobook, and I would recommend it that way. And I think it really leaves you thinking, and it's not a book I'm going to easily forget. Even though I didn't love reading it and the experience was a little boring, I think that the things it says are really interesting, and the way Emily Bronte talks about life and death and all of these themes is really interesting. In conclusion, do I think there's an audience for this book? Absolutely. I completely understand why people love it. Even though I would say I'm more in the middle on the book, I understand how it's so polarizing. And there's so many people who gave it 1 star and hated it, but there's even more people who love it. Thank you for watching. Tune in next time for episode 3, and I'm going to be reading Shatter Me this time. And make sure to follow Creative Communications on Twitter, handles on the screen, and subscribe to the YouTube down below.